Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCann.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
Um, any, we've got a couple topics I think we're really going to dive into today. Is there anything we should talk about beforehand? Maybe a few thoughts on the most recent debates, which we did a live stream over. I would add a very amateurish live stream. We had over 400 people watching us at one point, which is pretty cool for a first time ever live stream. I don't know what their impression was, but appreciate any people who tuned in to listen to us kind of talk over the candidates during the debate.
We were yapping our butts off.
Big time, especially you, but that's okay. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on that or any other current news stories going on. It's interesting. There's kind of one story I can think of that kind of is a result of the Democratic debate. We had Tulsi Gabbard, who actually had a really good takedown of Kamala Harris's record as a district attorney and as a prosecutor. And Tulsi, I believe it was Kamala Harris's campaign manager, responded by saying that Tulsi's campaign is being propped up by, quote, Russian bots. That was really interesting. And as people know here at the Antidote, we don't really I think we look at this perspective a lot more critically, a lot less black and white than a lot of other, alt media outlets, publications would look at. And so it's a very interesting statement for a number of reasons. It's like, on one hand, you don't want to be careful not to buy into like the ridiculous kind of over-the-top Cold War hysteria that's being pushed by elements of the media, maybe the Democratic establishment that is supportive of a candidate like Kamala Harris and doesn't like maybe Tulsi Gabbard's policies for various reasons. But also, on the other hand, it's not, when you really look at it from a deeper perspective, it's not as over-the-top, absurdly ridiculous as one might think. So it's one of those cases where there could be an element of truth in both responses. The idea that there are some interesting figures online or interesting aspects online that could be propping up a candidate like Gabbard, but at the same time, though, also acknowledging that her criticism of such an establishment darling like Kamala Harris is very true as well, and that could be the root of the scrutinizing by surrogates for someone like Miss Harris. It's very interesting.
Yes, I completely agree. Like that we shouldn't be simplistic in the way that we look at these things, or even reactionary, because it is the case that the response to Tulsi Gabbard by those that are seen as being propped up by the establishment is talking point propaganda in terms of she's an apologist for Assad. And yet there's aspects of that should be looked into in terms of the way that she has related to that whole situation, that there's some aspect of inquiry that is valid there, but that, yes, it's definitely a propaganda talking point. And at the same time, the very legitimate critiques that Gabbard used against Harris, which she didn't really respond to, and it sounds like Kamala Harris actually brought in the Assad, propping up by Tulsi's meeting with him talking point, was actually after the fact with Anderson Cooper on CNN after the debate had already finished. But it is the case, it's very obvious that Tulsi Gabbard is the choice of very specific groups, including the Russian state media. Obviously, they love her. Obviously, the aspects of the Fox News set and part of the Trump sphere, that she's their choice too. And it looks like it is the case too that there is bot activity that surrounds her online, some of the talk about her online. And I think people should just go look at the thread of Seth Abramson, who just points out some basic data around that, and then the kind of bot attack activity that came on his thread after he just pointed out one of these data points.
Yes, all very interesting points, and once again, it seems like we've made very clear, I think, our criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard, and I think a big part of it is the fact that she's seen by a lot of people within like this alt media sphere of the most critical elements of the people who really are like the pushback, or at least should be or purport themselves to be the those who are opposed to not only military intervention, not only what we call regime change wars, but also even the whole idea of this fraudulent, phony nature of this so-called war on terror to begin with. And that's where, for me, that's where my big criticisms of someone like Tulsi Gabbard comes from. And of course, we've talked about various aspects of her record over the years and things that she's been involved with in previous years, as well as the continued boosting by outlets such as, of course, Breitbart, and even Rabbi Shmuley Botiak continues to support her as a friend. And then there's some others as well. And even on Fox News earlier this week, Kevin McCarthy, who's the top Republican in the House, he basically said that Tulsi Gabbard won the debate. You know, she's been on Tucker Carlson's program to talk about after the first Democratic debate. So, I mean, that is the criticism there. And even someone like Ron Paul, who I thought was much better overall on the war on terror, obviously, in his talking points. I mean, he never spoke in like the hawkish way and like fighting terrorism that Tulsi Gabbard did, as kind of milquetoast and as weak ultimately as a lot of his talking points were with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, it's still much stronger, I think, than anything Tulsi's put out. And so it remains to be a combination of this the past rhetoric and very obvious statements and declarations of support made in the past to some of the most extreme of these pro-Israel Zionist organizations, as well as the continued support she gets from a lot of people within this what you could call war on terror hawks, or even Zionist hawks in a lot of ways, and also this network of operatives or, I guess, activists that are very much in a kind of in a Russia sphere that see kind of Russia, for example, as being the pushback to the American aggression in Syria, and how that figures in, I think, to a bigger picture of fighting the war on terror and continuing these the wars that started after the big lie of September 11th. So this continues to be a major concern. And even the way that Tulsi Gabbard is being criticized as she's got Russian bots running her campaign or supporting her online, and she's an Assad apologist. And I could see these. Honestly, I look at these kind of talking points, look at the way they've been used against even, like, say, Trump, for example, a lot of the Russia stuff. I mean, I could see this being used as a way to boost her campaign and prop her up. And I would even contrast that with someone like Marianne Williamson, who's being and I don't know what her motives are. I don't know exactly, I don't claim to purport or know what's in Marianne Williamson's heart or what she stands for or what she believes, and whether it's something that the vast majority of people could get behind. But the criticisms of her are coming out. She's a kook because she thinks vaccines, and she's had critical views on mandatory vaccinations and antidepressants, and also now it's just come out that she was on our sometimes associate Kevin Barrett on his radio program. She was on a 9/11 Truthers radio program, and she even described Kevin's questioning of September 11th is no different than questioning the Warren Commission. So, I mean, I would even contrast. I think Tulsi Gabbard, honestly, I think it looks like to me the criticism of her is in a way that may end up being much more to her benefit than even someone like a Marianne Williamson. So I would look at Tulsi and just even the way the criticism of her is coming about, I think could very well be done in a way ultimately that actually helps boost her as like this Democratic outsider candidate that will kind of be a factor in the race going on. So I look at it that way, and I could be wrong, but that's what I see coming out of this, and I definitely contrast it to someone like Marianne Williamson in that regard.
And we'll see if there is if traction is given to this. It looks like it's come out of Alternate, this story about Marianne Williamson going on Kevin Barrett's show in 2012. There's a lot of resonance with the attacks on Ajamu Baraka during the 2016 campaign about how he had been on Kevin Barrett's show. And it's interesting that it's Alternate that is the vector for this attack. And it is the case that it says that Marianne Williamson is quoted as saying that questioning 9/11 is just, she sees it as similar as questioning the Warren Commission, and that she also doesn't believe in the single bullet theory. So we'll see if they that whole sector of the controlled left that likes to take on people like Marianne Williamson from this place of kook, a woo-woo, a sort of anti-science. And when you actually go listen to what she actually says about her criticisms of big pharma in relationship anywhere from antidepressants to vaccines, it's very measured, it's very reasonable. And I would just point out, especially in the day and age of where it's becoming obvious to people that things like Monsanto's Roundup and glyphosate, the spraying, how basically all of our food now has this, what is now being seen very obviously as cancer-causing agents, and not only cancer, but the destruction of the human gut biome, which more and more is understood as basically the second brain. It's basically the brain in more encapsulated in the body, key to the immune system, but also key apparently to properly functioning thought process and brain function. And so it's interesting that the attack is on her for being the closest one to actually dealing with that very total assault on the American people's health via things like Roundup sprayed all around the place and in entering into mother's milk and all kinds of food, and even like organic food has traces of it apparently because it's all over the environment. So we'll see where that attack goes. And in terms of Tulsi Gabbard, it's interesting. She has a lot of, I think, a lot of good positions on a whole array of topics.
Yes, definitely. And I will concede, and we said this during our live stream, I thought her criticism of Kamala Harris was spot on, and it was also, I think it was a very powerful critique and a very powerful pushback, and I do think that that's certainly driving this immediate response by the Kamala Harris campaign, as well as I think a few people on MSNBC piled onto this talking point as well. So it's obvious that her truthful statements on Kamala Harris's record, I think, are driving this particular pushback that's being directed at her at the moment. So, I do give her that. And there's a lot of areas where I do think that there certainly are a lot of areas that she has, where she is maybe more correct than most on. So I do concede that for sure.
Which makes the places where there's something wrong with her positions being even more glaring. And it is interesting that it appears to be in this grouping surrounding these questions specifically about Israel and Russia, I would say. And that's where you see her holding these talking points. For example, after I think it was after the Mueller report, or it was actually after the Barr letter, I think, that really mischaracterized even the milquetoast aspects of the Mueller report. I believe that Tulsi Gabbard came out and said on video that it was a good thing that that Mueller was not able to establish a conspiracy of Trump or the Trump campaign with the Russians, because if he did, then it might have caused civil war. Was her point. To me, that's exactly like in the realm of the Alex Jones propaganda, disinformation, and it also the other talking point that she uses a lot is the threat of nuclear war. That it's sort of the civil war and the nuclear war. That if some of these, I would call them truths, because the part of the 2016 of the 11/9 operation that's just touched on inside of the Mueller report is just a little piece of what actually went down there, including the fact that all of the Israeli ties are not even included in his investigation because it was focused on Russia. But that is all there. And so Tulsi's talking points of the threat of nuclear war and civil war, to me, is so much in line with what we now know is the disinformation propaganda talking points of the InfoWars to, I would say, Russian state media axis. And so that's an issue. And when you see that her go also on Bill Maher's show, she was featured on Bill Maher's show, and he asked her about Putin's involvement, and she completely sidestepped it and avoided it completely.
Yeah.
So I think that when you added to the aspects of her record that we've talked about very directly in terms of her bolstering the Al-Qaeda architected 9/11 lie, I believe that lie is treasonous on its face.
And she constantly does it, even when she's making strong points about even talking about the Iraq War. I think she did address the Iraq War briefly during the debate. Was it Iraq or Iran? I think it was Iran she addressed briefly, or she addressed it during the debate, and pushed back against one lie it was Iraq. I'm pretty sure it was the Iraq War. Pushes back against one lie while continuing to uphold and perpetuate another lie. That's just not acceptable for me.
Yeah, because she says that the problem was that she signed up to fight Al Qaeda after 9/11,
right.
And the problem was that Iraq was a distraction from that. In a certain way, it's just right up the alley of the whole CFR Richard Haas supplied talking points to Barack Obama as he came in 2008, 2009 about war of necessity, war of choice as the division between the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity because they attacked us, or Al-Qaeda attacked us from the hills of Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq was a war of choice. In Tulsi Gabbard's, linguistics, she would call it a regime change war.
Yes.
And so when you combine all of this, these are very serious issues that she has a very bad take on, I believe a dishonest take on, with a very significant implications. So I think that we need to continue to stay aware of those aspects, while at the same time being able to call out and critique the Kamala Harris's and the Joe Bidens and all of that. And just one last point, it should be pointed out that in a certain way, even Tulsi Gabbard's attack on Kamala Harris was initiated in a certain way, as she'd been on the record after the Kamala Harris attack on Biden, as that it was a disingenuous and that Biden's not a racist, and so in a certain way it can all be seen as a defense of Biden.
That's interesting, because I wouldn't say Tulsi Gabbard would be knowingly pushing a talking point like this, but I would actually doubt that she is. But it's interesting that among some of these within the right-wing media, that you're starting to get this talking point become more and more prevalent, that Joe Biden's being singled out and targeted by the radical crazy leftists because he's an old white man, and therefore he's not a crazy radical liberal like they are. So it's interesting that within the right-wing narrative, that kind of the right-wing media, there's this talking point increasing more and more, that it's almost like this kind of this dog whistling idea of just the equating being against that criticizing Joe Biden and really zeroing in on his obvious horrific history as one of the most prominent of the establishment Democratic Party's stranglehold over much of our political system for the last 3 or 4 decades, is somehow because he's just he's an old white man, and there's no room for old white men who aren't radical leftists within the Democratic Party. So it's that's just that's kind of a go ahead.
And Greg, as we move into talking, we're going to still we had begun researching John Ratcliffe. A few days ago, and as we were beginning to research the recording of our next antidote, and he was being proposed as to take over for Dan Coates for the Director of National Intelligence, and since then he's actually withdrawn his nomination. But we still want to touch on a few points about his background and what the very least it still means about the agenda behind this aspect of the Trump administration, in terms of putting someone like Ratcliffe forward to be the head of national intelligence. But before that, Greg, will you just fill people in just real briefly about this connection of Tulsi Gabbard to Ivan Raiklin, and who Ivan Raiklin is and why that might matter?
Yes, Ivan Raiklin is he worked with Michael Flynn in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he's appears to be a pretty close associate to Michael Flynn, which would probably put him in the sphere of this Michael Flynn, Ezra Cohen Watnick network. You could throw Derek Harvey and the other Flynn associate who was pushed out by H.R. McMaster for pushing the deep state memo, and we can provide links to that in our show notes.
It was sort of like that Harvey scenario was like being pushed also by like the sort of Frank Gaffney,
yes.
InfoWars. This is a Maoist insurgency against a real patriot like Donald Trump from within the bureaucracy, right?
Yes, and these kind of talking points were pushed by this entire network that I think John Swin who's got his new website on Know the Enemy. John Swin on his
Expose the Enemy.
Yeah. John Swin on his has had his excellent infographics up, including his infographic of the entire network of Zionist operatives that targeted H.R. McMaster for removal as soon as they went after Ezra Cohen Watnick, really. So anyway. So Ivan Reichlen, I took notice of him when he was on InfoWars with Owen Schroyer to talk about Michael Flynn's defense, basically. And turns out Ivan Reichlen is the son of Soviet immigrants who came after the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which basically opened up for Soviet Jews to immigrate to the United States in the latter days of the Cold War. And actually, it's interesting, Ivan Reichlen, I didn't know this until after I left Cedar Falls, Iowa, his father was a professor at the University of Northern Iowa, and I was living in Cedar Falls for close to 2 years, and so part of my research on Ivan Reichlen comes directly from the local Cedar Falls, Waterloo, Iowa newspaper, and I had no idea of that, so that's pretty interesting. I believe he taught Russian history at the University of Northern Iowa. Ivan Reichlen's father. Anyway, Ivan Reichlen is a big supporter of Flynn. He's a close associate of his. He's a big-time supporter of Trump within a lot of within circles. He's not very well known, but he certainly has influence within these circles. He's also been a Green Beret in the past. An interesting note about Ivan Reichlen on his LinkedIn profile, it mentions here, this is very interesting. It also appears that Ivan Reichlen is working within some Talpiot, possible Talpiot-style AI programs, technological research. This is all on his LinkedIn profile, which we will link to in our show notes. But I want to read a little bit from this LinkedIn profile where Tulsi Gabbard's name is mentioned. And anyway, I'm having trouble getting to the LinkedIn link of Ivan Reichlen here. But anyway, in this, it talks about a joint program for members of Congress who I believe are still active military. And Ivan Reichlen mentions that I believe this is a group that meets, the Joint IMA Detachment. I believe it meets on Wednesdays, and it's for members of Congress who have been military or active duty, and for other, I guess, people within those circles. And Ivan Reichlen mentions a few names who have been guests at these events. And he mentions, very interesting, the three names who Ivan Reichlen mentions: Lindsey Graham, Ron DeSantis, the former congressman who is now the governor of Florida, who was leading the push for the Golan Heights to be recognized by Trump as Israeli territory, and now is over in Florida signing all kinds of anti-BDS legislations. We actually went to Israel to do that as governor of Florida. And the other person mentioned is Tulsi Gabbard. So I found that very interesting.
And how do you spell Ivan Reichlen?
Ivan, IvanRaiklin. Ivan Reichlen. That's his name. And
so he mentions DeSantis, Lindsey Graham, who, by the way, is more and more coming under deep scrutiny, both that his emails were apparently hacked, potentially by Russia. There is even interesting pictures of him with Blavatnik, with Leonard Blavatnik, and Alan, what's his name?
Alan,
the lawyer.
Oh, not Trump's lawyer.
No,
Dershowitz.
Alan Dershowitz.
Oh, okay.
And then also that Lindsey Graham has just gone forth and broken recognized Senate rules to push forth some of Trump's policy. So there's a lot of heat on Lindsey Graham. A lot of people have known for a long time that there's obviously some type of compromise in the background of Lindsey Graham, and then Tulsi Gabbard as part of this group. And a lot of questions have come up about Tulsi Gabbard's involvement in all of these different groups, from the Christians United for Israel to the Council on Foreign Relations. But then it's always said, well, she just likes to talk to everybody. But specifically this group that you've now identified, organized via someone like Ivan Reichlin, who does look like he ties into this whole Talpiot program agenda. And we may even want to touch on this very interesting article from Narrative, Narrativ, that really lays out the connections between the Epstein network to Israel, Russia, and advanced technology, and that whole scenario. And as far as I know, this Narrative article, what's it called? I forget what it's called. Something about building AI or Building Big Brother. By Zev Shalev and Tracy McElroy. And I believe these people have a mainstream media background. But this article really, really goes into a lot of stuff that if you've been listening to like people like us and the whole sort of Talpiot crew for a while, this is really nailing that down. And then one last thing on this article is that as far as I know, this is the first confirmation via a source, someone they're calling a source, that Epstein was Israeli intelligence, and they are saying, they're asserting that they have this. It's an anonymous source, but they're saying it's a recognized source who would know in relationship to Israeli intelligence. And so, on top of the Costa, phrase that he was told that Epstein was intelligence, and I believe that comes from Vicky Ward, the author who had originally written some of this information about Epstein back more than 10 years ago. That this is the first confirmation in the mainstream media, let's call it, that Epstein is directly tied into Israeli intelligence.
And not to take away from, I don't want to take anything away from Whitney Webb's excellent series of articles on Mint Press News about Epstein, but I do think that an article like this Narrative article is willing to connect some dots that Whitney Webb, for whatever reason, did not mention in her story, much less China, but also Russia. And obviously, as we've talked about in the past, there seems to be a major issue with Mint Press News not being willing to address the many Russian aspects of these ongoing type of Zionist operations or Israel or spy rings or efforts to undermine America from a Zionist pro-Israel perspective, as we've mentioned with Richard Silverstein's series of articles or the article that was not published on Mint Press with that relayed detailed history of KGB agents being high up in the Israeli government. And so, I don't want to take anything away from that, but I do think that an article like this goes a couple of steps further and maybe gets into some areas that were not breached on by this other series of articles.
Yeah, and so any serious researcher should read all of these articles together, because in a certain way, this Narrative article is a follow-up and a deepening and a widening of the story put out by Johnny Venmore, I think his name is, that we covered last time, about the UK connection, the Junkerman connection to Epstein and Israeli intelligence. And this Narrative story deals with some of that aspect. But like you said, it also deals with the Michael Cohen connection. I'm just going to quote from this real briefly. The Michael Cohen connection, quote, "In addition to Epstein and Barack, Russian oligarchs Viktor Vekselberg and Andrew Intrater bought 24% of Carbine's Class A1 shares through Intrater's Columbus Nova Technology Partners, CNTP, in September 2017. An aside there, that Carbine is this sort of alternative 9/11 or an insertion into the 911 emergency notice architecture by apparent Israeli intelligence that was covered in the Venmore article.
And this article, I believe, gets into Peter Thiel's role with Carbine.
Yes, and so I'll leave that there in terms of this narrative article, but I agree with you that the Whitney Webb articles at Mint Press News have a whole bunch of very important information. Especially what she does is she deals with the American background of the Epstein networks, including Roy Cohn, and all throughout this background of American Jewish oligarchs, and all the way into the FBI, Meyer Lansky's apparent relationship or compromise with J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI and all of that. And I believe that her next article coming out probably this coming week has to do with the mega connection.
Yeah.
And like you, on our live stream, Greg, you said like we don't, not to toot our horns, but we should so often just recognize some of the research that we've been doing that finally is gaining traction in a much wider sphere, both in terms of the alternative media, but also obviously in the mainstream media. And the mega group had basically been sort of forgotten about as a key grouping of power in the United States of America, and especially in relationship to Israel for many years. And then we were able to bring it back and put it firmly in the middle of this Trump operation, and it was your hearing of Jerome Corsi on a live stream talking about the relationship of Henry Kissinger, and how Corsi claims he helped put Kissinger directly into the orbit, into the White House to talk with Donald Trump, and basically, as Corsi put it, to direct his Middle East policy. Yeah. And then we connected that with some of the investigations that I'd been doing about Mega Group, and that people like John Swin had been following up on in terms of the Epstein-Wexner mega connection. And we were able to then connect this Mega Group to an assertion that this is at the heart of the Donald Trump operation and this relationship with Kissinger and all of that. So I'm very interested to see what the good research that Whitney Webb does in terms of these realms, what she will bring to the table. And at the same time, like you pointed out, that's obviously an issue with the Mint Press sphere. There is a general unwillingness to deal with the Russian angle, the Soviet angle to all of this. But if you're a researcher, then you can read all of these different pieces and put them all together.
Yeah, it was Israeli intel above Mossad. And I will toot our horn that if it wasn't for our broadcast and us actually playing the clip of Corsi talking about this, where he basically tries to whitewash the concerns of people on his live stream who have concerns with Henry Kissinger being deep state or evil or whatever. You just like, oh, he's evil or whatever you guys think, big deal. Kissinger, we can get some value out of what he's about in this aspect. So he basically just whitewashed concerns about Kissinger, which is pretty funny. But he described it, of course, as intel above Mossad, Israeli intel above Mossad. Probably the same intel above Mossad who was happy to have him go on InfoWars and say that Trump is being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. But anyway, in that regard, though, with this whole Mint Press thing, I mean, one of the things is that well, interestingly, the Botox spook, as I call him, David Duke, he did cover the Mega Group on one of his shows, and John Swin suspects that he may or may not have taken info from some of us, which may or may not be true, but it was also done in a way that was very controlled and was in a way to only tie Israel into this, and then also in the case of David Duke to tie Trump's enemies to this whole operation in kind of a different way than, say, like your InfoWars type of outlets will go about it, and also calling Robert Maxwell Mossad and all of this, which is obviously true. But if you only talk about Robert Maxwell, for example, and I can see this within a Mint Press News type of sphere, if you only talk about Robert Maxwell as Mossad without bringing in his obvious history with KGB and Russian Soviet interests, then I think that that's only half of the truth, and by default, it's misleading at best.
Yeah, and that's what this narrative article really does really well. Like they put together a graphic of the people involved in these in this company, in these companies, and in this network of Jeffrey Epstein. And they, like you said, they put Peter Thiel on there. They have Ehud Barak, Victor Vexelberg, Andrew Intrater. They have Eric Prince in there, the government of Israel, the former commander of Unit 8200, Pinchas Burkus, Lital Leshem, Amir Elichai, and then they also get into Michael Chertoff being right there, and they deal with that aspect of it. And then they also deal with the China connection, which is really crucial to this. And I would remind people once again that for all of the disparagement of the Steele dossier, a key piece of it says that the Trump campaign itself and the Trump people themselves are happy to have all of the talk about Russia because they are even much more deeply involved and compromised by other foreign governments, including China. And that is obviously true.
Yeah. Remember when the Robert Kraft was arrested and linked to that day spa, and all of these GOP operatives were taking photos with the with the owner of this Chinese American day spa that Robert Kraft was said to be soliciting prostitutes and possibly even worse off underage women in sexual acts. I mean, I don't know if there's any evidence of actual underage involvement going on, but certainly there were. He was involved in sex acts he shouldn't have been involved in. Hence the reason for the arrest. And so, I mean, this was just one example, and that was swept under the rug pretty quickly, but all these photos began surfacing of all these GOP figures being photographed with this founder of this day spa that Robert Kraft frequented, of course, which was within like 20-30 minutes of Mar-a-Lago. So that's just one example. And so it does seem that the China connection could even be, I mean, I could say more important than the Russian connection, but it's something that is very key to this, that is, even in all of this nonstop talk about Russia is being left out of the box a little bit, while we also have this new Cold War, over the top hysteria about China that's very within like the right wing media, that's very similar to how like the resistance type media covers Russia.
Yeah, and I think it is the case that the China connection here and the Chinese role in relationship, especially to this analysis about the importance of high technology and a globalized economy, most obviously related to Israeli military intelligence and the Talpiot program. And people definitely go back to, Brendan O'Connell's, his sort of first 8 videos that really deal with a lot of this and a lot of these connections and this transfer. I think it's becoming very, very obvious that China really is the driver in many ways of this economic move to globalize a booby-trapped smart city type of surveillance city program worldwide. Obviously, with the Belt Road Initiative, people can go and listen even to a Democracy Now! Show last week with some mainstream news reporting out of things like Human Rights Watch and the BBC in relationship to the Chinese government surveillance using this exact kind of technology that Israel has been at the epicenter of, and most obviously since September 11th, in relationship to the Chinese domestic Uyghur population and the concentration camps. And what's interesting about it is, with one of the journalists who was on there kept making the point that the reason that this was so crucial to China was this was all about the Belt Road Initiative in the Xinjiang province, and that this was the epicenter of the Belt Road Initiative, and that was the reason for this surveillance grid control technology implementation, most blatantly against the Uyghur Muslims. And I thought it interesting that Amy Goodman seemed to avoid that core point, but at the same time, it's starting to be talked about in many ways. And even this narrative article goes right into the China connection. And I'll just read briefly about that. Quote, the China connection. Carbine has ties to China through co-founder Lital Leshem. Leshem, who remains a shareholder at Carbine, now works alongside Eric Prince at Frontier Resources Group, FRG. FRG is based in the UAE and is a subsidiary of Prince's Frontier Services Group, FSG. Prince sold a majority stake in FSG to the Chinese in 2013. His boss is now Chang Jingming, who is very close to President Xi Jinping. Chang is also chair of China's massive CITIC group. Prince is a former U.S. Navy SEAL and a founder of Blackwater, a mercenary contractor. FSG is one of the companies helping to build, quote, retraining camps for ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslim communities in China's Xinjiang province. China detains 1 million people in those camps and keeps 13 million people under surveillance. In May, Human Rights Watch revealed Chinese authorities use a platform not unlike Carbine to illegally surveil Uyghurs. China's Integrated Joint Operations Platform brings in a much bigger data set and sources of video, which includes an app on people's phones. Like Carbine, the platform was designed to report emergencies. Chinese authorities have turned it into a tool of mass surveillance, and then it talks about the angle of the Muslim aspect of the Uyghurs and their traditions. But I think this is really, really key here. When we started investigating Eric Prince in relationship to the Trump administration, we kept pointing out this Israel connection, and that the Israel connection with Prince was via people like Ari Haro and Dorian Barak. Go look again at Dorian Barak. It was immediately connected to China. And I've also pointed out that when you go look at, Microsoft's purchasing of Adalom cybersecurity to basically, as I've called the Talpiot program, basically a corporate mole program, and bringing in these high-level Talpiot co-founders of Adalom, including Asaf Rappaport, to basically head up the Microsoft corporate cybersecurity of cloud systems, right as they are beginning to become a bidder for the Pentagon Cloud, the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure scenario. That Asaf Rappaport, go look at his background, and it's also via China. It's about, I believe he was a McKinsey consultant in China. So this is a key piece of this, and I am suspicious even of things like in the midst of the Kansas City Library arrest case. I began to become aware of a company called FST, based upon a former head of Israeli military intelligence named General Aharon Zevi Farkash, who's also a former head of Unit 8200, and came up with this idea from working at the checkpoints from Palestine into now Israel, of this idea of in-motion identity management, where it was not only facial recognition, but it was about the way that you move, your bodily posture. And they started a company that had Ehud Barak on the board, and people like Gary Feigl, who came out of Glencore. Of course, that's the Mark Rich sort of Switzerland aluminum component there. And what was interesting is in the year after I put some of this on the record in relationship to the Kansas City Public Library case, that business, FST, supposedly sort of goes out of business because the technology is more difficult than they say. My suspicion, and I don't have evidence for this yet, is that some of that technology was actually being transferred to be mass produced in relationship to Chinese technology. And one of the things that Brendan O'Connell always rightly pointed out was that the plan here was to marry Israeli technology with Chinese capacity. And so this is that angle is at the heart of a lot of what is going on here in relationship to these Arab princes and their relationship with not only Russia but also China. And so we'll link to some stories that really deal with the background here. For example, there's an interesting TechCrunch story from 2016, Chinese tech giant Guangxi harnesses Israeli tech to build smart cities in China. And in the heart of that is the recognition of Dorian Barak, Indigo Global, as really at the epicenter of this increasing relationship of marrying Israeli technology to Chinese industrial capacity. And the background again of Dorian Barak is he is also formerly at the law firm Skadden Arps, which is at the epicenter, I would assert, of the legal cover up of 9/11, the payoffs, the second paymaster of September 11th, Sheila Birnbaum, comes through Skadden Arps, and I've also pointed out that Skadden Arps to me looks like it is one of, if not, I think the leading legal firm in the United States of America that is directly tied into Israeli technology and startups and this whole issue potentially of technology transfer. Which is maybe then what we can do in our last, 15 minutes here, Greg, of talking about John Ratcliffe and what is going on behind the scenes in terms of his being put forth as the potential, director of national intelligence. Now rescinded, but what was the actual reasoning behind that beyond what everyone's talking about how he has the good talking points that Trump likes in terms of the Fox News so-called conspiracy theories and the attack on Mueller, the attack on the Russia investigation and all of that. We think that actually something above that is very likely the case for the choice of someone like him, and I believe that it actually ties into what Jaleel Al-Askari is actually he sent me too, that there's a new bill. It's called a Senate bill would create U.S.-Israel Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Senators Mike Rounds, Republican from South Dakota, and Jackie Rosen, the Democrat from Nevada, introduced new legislation on July 30th that would require the State Department to investigate the potential benefits of establishing a cooperative U.S.-Israel Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. The bill, dubbed the U.S.-Israel Cybersecurity Center of Excellence Act, has garnered bipartisan support in the Senate, and Representative David Cicilline, Democrat from Rhode Island, has already introduced a companion bill in the House. Quote, Israel is a world leader in cybersecurity. Partnering with this close ally on a cybersecurity center of excellence where experts can share best practices and other critical information can help us bolster the cyber capabilities of both nations, unquote, said Rounds, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee Cybersecurity Subcommittee. So that aspect of creating a center for excellence, and these centers for excellence they were set up, I think, post September 11th to be academic hotbeds in the United States of specific investigations. So, for example, over here, I believe the University of Kansas has maybe a cybersecurity center of excellence via some aspect of the computer science school, I think. But they're all around the country. But this, as far as I know, is the first one where it's going to be a partnership with a foreign country, and of course, the country is Israel. And then this links in with what we discovered about the background of John Ratcliffe.
Real quick before we get into that, and we're going to bring up his background here in a minute, and I wanted to go back real quick. I want to go back to Ivan Reichland, because I was looking through his LinkedIn profile, and where it mentions a lot of the possible Talpiot style groups that he's involved with that he's been involved with in the Silicon Valley area, as well as DC. But one more person who was listed as being in this Congressional Reserve Joint IMA detachment as having spoken to this group is Congressman Mike Waltz. And Michael Waltz was just elected to Congress to replace the aforementioned Ron DeSantis, who's going on to be the governor of Florida. But Michael Waltz was a National Guard Special Forces officer, veteran of the War of Afghanistan, first Green Beret ever elected to Congress. He served as a senior advisor to Vice President Cheney for South Asia and terrorism. And then he was just counterterrorism. And he was just elected to Congress, and he's shaping up as a major hawk in Republican Congress right now. So that's one more name that was mentioned as being part of this, is having affiliation with this joint IMA detachment that Tulsi Gabbard has been a member of in the past, along with Lindsey Graham and Ron DeSantis. So I wanted to throw one more name out there and put another name onto the map that we're not going to discuss right now, but I think we're going to look into this for future reference. Mike Madsen from a group called the Defense Innovation Unit, which has Pentagon connections. That'll be something to look into in the future. So I wanted to just add that real quick to this point here, that this is the kind of people who Gabbard It just seems everything you look into with her, it just seems that she's always associating with these kind of people in one capacity or another. So this is another example of that.
And over and over again, we keep seeing this Cheney cell pop up in relationship to the characters in the Trump administration. Definitely in relationship to someone like Samantha Ravitch, who we pointed out was brought on to the Intelligence Advisory Board to help out Steven Feinberg, the Cerberus Capital, that whole background that also then links into the Wall Street grouping, right, Greg? He was at what's the name of
Drexel Burnham Lambert.
Along in this key moment there surrounding the Michael Milken scandals, but even we talked about Grunthal in the background there of Felix Sater, who calls himself Moishe Bond. People actually might want to go look at a very interesting set of informative videos that Stephen Kelley has done on Truth Cat Radio, specifically about the background of people like Sater and this, this Jewish mob connection as it ties in via the United States, Israel, and Russia, and all of that background. But Grunthal and this background, of course, is that what's his name from the UK is also involved with Drexel Burnham Lambert. During that
Nigel
key time.
Farage.
Nigel
Mr.
Farage.
Brexit.
So with the upcoming sort of Boris Johnson and that whole crew and the Brexit crew and all of that, more and more we're beginning to see this network really come into power here. And I would just point out that it was Liz Cheney, right, Greg, who is then ultimately featured at the so-called alternative media,
social media summit. Yeah,
social media summit, right.
Yeah, she was brought on stage to, and give credit to Robbie Martin for pointing this out. That's who I heard this from on Media Roots Radio. He talked about how she was brought on stage with Trump to brag about getting Scooter Libby pardoned. And this is an event where you've got people like Mark Dice hanging out, and Sebastian Gorka and the CNN reporter with Uncle Jimbo from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies out there cheering on Sebastian Gorka. So this is just to me, the idea of her being involved with something like that's just extremely surreal, even for this whole thing. And then the likes of Mark Dice just being there rubbing shoulders with these people. That's really disturbing, actually.
And this whole scenario with Samantha Ravitch being not only Chertoff Group, but also Washington Institute for Near East Policy, but also a key aide to Dick Cheney, that in the midst of all of this, we're seeing this they're basically over and over and over, we're seeing these basically Israeli dual nationals in place, along with these domestic operations, will often hook into the sort of Cheney and Prince networks that are setting up these so-called collaborations where it's Israel and the United States. In the case of Samantha Ravitch, she was proposing this sort of terror umbrella group that was the Israel, the United States, and the UK, in some way sort of going at it alone, as opposed to including NATO and Europe as sort of you might think of in terms of a follow-up to the Cold War dynamics of the nuclear umbrella and all of that. But to this issue with Ratcliffe, what we found was that he had put forth this bill called the United States-Israel Advanced Research Partnership Act of 2016. This is November 29th of 2016. So right there in the wake of the election, during the transition into the Trump administration, and so then I just want to read from Ratcliffe. Okay, United States-Israel Advanced Research Partnership Act of 2016. Mr. Ratcliffe says, Mr. Speaker, quote, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5877 to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 and the United States-Israel Strategic Partnership Act of 2014 to promote cooperative Homeland Security research and anti-terrorism programs relating to cybersecurity and for other purposes as amended. Okay, unquote. So just thinking about the title here, the Advanced Research Partnership Act, to me, that sounds like a follow-up, a next generation of ARPA or DARPA, the Advanced Research Projects I forget what it stands for, right? But where the internet is birthed out of, and so to me, it's interesting when you take it along with this
Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Thank you, Greg. That when you put it along with this just recent move that Jaleel told me about this move to create a center of excellence in relationship to Israel, and now you have Ratcliffe leading the way, having led the way on creating a new DARPA setup that's also just with Israel, and you begin to see how this is the epicenter of this long-term treasonous operation. Really, it has to do with technology transfer. It has to do with basically setting up Israel in many ways to be the epicenter of the next generation of the technology that drives the global economy and also drives so-called national security. And as we pointed out over and over and over, this really tight relationship that Israel has had over many, many decades in relationship to China and Russia and their national security states. So in the midst of all of this, continues to be what's happening here over and over and over. We're seeing these characters that are being pushed into these positions by the Trump administration having so-called, just out of coincidentally having been the key movers of these kind of bills and policy and acts. And Greg, you got this book called The Armageddon Network that we found by Michael Saba, which is a very interesting book about the background of Richard Pearl, Stephen Bryan, and their relationship to Israeli spying networks. And a key piece of this book, and I'm beginning to really read through it, has to do with technology transfer, and also what Michael Saba says that the policy that the people like the Pearls and the Bryans are setting forth is actually meant to undermine at some level U.S. economic relationships with the rest of the world, and to actually transfer those opportunities to Israel. And we saw that exact type of thing begin to happen in relationship to Trump and the tariffs and all of that. It looks like there's a severing of the United States. The United States is just sort of supposed to go it alone because of its hosile relationship with Iran. And then Europe breaks off, and then Europe begins to develop its own relationships, via more like mediated by the East, in terms of Russia, in terms of Iran and all of that. And so as I learn more and more about this from this Armageddon Network book that you've lent me, Greg, by Michael Saba, I'm hoping that we'll begin to put together the longer-term policy strategic planning initiatives that really might explain exactly what this Trump pump and dump Trump operation really is. And Greg,
sure.
I think we have a minute left, so
okay.
Finish us up.
And I was just thinking what you were saying there about this splitting off of basically the U.S. from Europe and from the East, and where you do have this dual. It seems there's this dual operation at place, whereas on one hand the U.S. does keep up the pressure on Iran as far as the traditional anti-Iran neocon hawks, but also it is undermining the U.S. globally, and I think that's done in a way to push the rest of the world, and particularly the West and even parts of the Western world, closer to this Russian Eastern axis, which of course Russia has a vested interest in, splitting the U.S. from, Europe from, NATO, as well as a lot of economic policies that Russia sees as being, hostile to it, as well as Israel, and former Ambassador Michael Oren's statement about Israel benefiting from a splintered EU, which is why I think the whole Israeli-Russian dual interest come to place with Brexit, and an outlet like Breitbart being right at the very center of that. As I've said numerous times before, I think that's important. So,
well, thank you so much, Greg, and until next time, talk to you later.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.